Hello, this is Ben, and welcome to the third part of our series on war and borders. I just rewatched the first two parts. They were shot at a different time, so I've had some time to reflect, and I wrote a couple of stuff down. And I'm not trying to come to a conclusion, so it's interesting to think, how are you going to do a final part on something if the goal is just to be fun? And in this regard, I think I've made my point, and as a very just simple synthesis. Obviously, borders make things less fun. For example, if you want to cross from one country to another country, you have to go through customs. Customs isn't fun. This is not groundbreaking. This isn't blowing your mind, but why can't that be a philosophical argument? I don't feel like people make these arguments. Kant was all about duty, the denial of desire, and while, Nietzsche was very quick to point out, that Kant turns people into moral automatons, and he was building on Arthur Schopenhauer's criticism that all morality actually is hypothetical imperatives and not categorical imperatives. And we're getting into some really, theoretical morality there. And I'm fine with that. It shouldn't be avoided. Morality often takes the stance that things shouldn't be fun, and that's a legacy that exists in philosophy. So, my argument is that borders are more fun. We can just go places, we can be together, they will remove identities that keep us apart. And yet, even in the beginning of part 2, though, I did say that some separateness makes sense. And perhaps it's an exaggeration, really, on my part, to say that the world should have absolutely no borders at all. Because one very obvious border that I actually think should exist would be the border between the right hemisphere of the Earth and the left hemisphere. And I'm using a little bit of brain terminology there, but let's instead, to avoid confusion, say East Hemisphere and West Hemisphere. If you look on a map and someone asks you what's the east side or the west side of the world, what's the left side or the right side, mostly uninitiated individual would point out natural differences between the one over here and the one over there. One very practical problem that this solves, in fact, is that if we reduce the world to one border, and therefore two nations, we eliminate the issues of international waters. Which, if you watch enough YouTube lately, I think I mentioned that, actually, in a prior video, and maybe I might even add in editing, but just so you know, it's not like, it's still authentic, because I'm telling you I'm going to edit it in. But there's a piece I made about the borderless world that at this point I think has been cut, that I really enjoyed, and I'll play it right now. We're morally obligated to the people around us in the world anyway, and that's just, we're morally obligated. Not morally welcomed, morally encouraged. We're morally obligated to take care of the people that don't live near us. We're morally obligated not to pollute 300 times more than every other country combined because of borders. We're talking about accountability. We're talking about all the things that people want in the world. And as crazy as this might seem, what borders are doing right now is they're giving people a place to escape to. And that is what the border represents. As strange it is, as much as I complain about separateness, all of that stuff, it's not really about what the borders are keeping out. It's about what the borders are letting out. And borders are great at keeping good intentions in. But that just makes it all the more powerful when bad intentions get out. And so what's going on is that that borderless world I'm talking about, it already exists. And it's been mapped by criminal networks. People that operate outside the so-called governments, you know? People act without borders. There are doctors without borders. It's a charity. Please, that's a charity. There already is the dream of the borderless world and the people who act in the world as if it were borderless. So you just listen to that, and I make the point that the borderless world already exists, and that borderless world is international waters. And when you look at TV nowadays, like, I'm probably referencing Matt Pat and film theory here, so shout out to you too, but there's the theory that what makes Squid Games possible, the very popular Korean show, what makes it possible is that it happens on international waters. And what's interesting, and why it still makes sense even to have one border, is that if you have absolutely no borders at all, it does create the sense that there are no governments, there are no moralities, there are no legalities. If we create a border, I've said that we declare war, but that only happens with static or unnatural borders. The border between the east side of the world and the west side of the world clearly exists, and people can see that even if they look at a map, so it makes sense. And I've made the point that borders, yes, I argue that they're unnatural, but they are also natural. There's no reason to get ideological about it or get couched into one or the other. So if you have one border, the west side still gets to regulate itself, and the east side still gets to regulate itself. People still have freedom to choose something, and it's not unlimited freedom, but it's not like we acknowledge that citizenship is an unlimited thing either. There's only, like, right now 190 something choices of citizenships to choose from, so having unlimited choices isn't always better, but so long as there are two choices, then there is still freedom of citizenship to some extent. And I even wrote something down here, is that we still can't expect borders to be static. We still can't expect that even when we go with purely natural borders. Everything must change. I have a graphic, by the way, so I'm going to put up that graphic now, and you can look at that. And but this, I really wanted to just write down my argument in some version, and I'll even pop it open myself here. And I conclude, and I purposely make a very radical conclusion, by the way. So I begin, as I was saying here, all things must change. Therefore, it is natural for borders to change, even if the borders are natural. And even though you're looking at it there, I'm writing it down in the thing right now. Even if borders and then second point, there is only one way to change a border: war. And so the second point is that if we create this world of just eastern and western borders, then we can also create a mechanism of drawing new borders. What I wrote down is what I call this realignments plus one. And the idea here is that if ever it seems like borders need to change, you have a realignment, which is you throw out all the borders and you redraw them, and at this point what you do is you redraw 3 borders as 4. So whenever there's a realignment, you will add a new nation. And then if at any point it seems like these borders don't work, you can at any point in time default back to the first one, which is eastern and western. If there's any point where borders become so unfixably unnatural for whatever reason, we have the natural borders, and that's what we can do. We can have the natural borders, make the borders unnatural, and then return them back to naturalness. And this is an entire process that we can do to avoid war. And, you know, it's better than gerrymandering, and there's really not too much more to say about it. Borders can make sense. There's a phenomenon in memory called chunking, where you remember a phone number as the first 3 digits and the last 4 digits because it's easier than trying to remember all 7 digits individually. Borders can be landmarks. And that's another point, is when we ask ourselves, when we create a border, I say if you don't have borders, you don't have war. Obviously that's not a proper conclusion. And it shows the limit of the argument, and it shows how much of what the argument applies to. Because there are reasons we go to war that aren't about borders, and yet I think because borders have always been involved, borders has obscured the other reasons why we go to war. And so the goal in getting rid of borders isn't really to end war, it's to end that war and explore what new things we will fight wars for.